Assalamu alaikum. This is Engineer Ahmed Fayez, and today we're presenting to you risk assessment guidelines for information security. In today's video, we're going to talk about risk assessment definition and value, and risk assessment methodology. So what is risk actually? What is the definition of risk? Most of us around the world, in organizations and individuals, use information systems, whether to perform vital or non-vital tasks. So these systems operate in a risky environment. These risks include any threat that affects the organization, internally or externally. So what are risks examples? So how do you define risks more thoroughly than that? For example, we can consider human errors. Human errors could be leaking, for example, secure information unintentionally, like, for example, leaking your password or leaking a password for an administrative account that has access to all of the employee information. Another example for risks is vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are exploits that can be exploited and used against the system creator, which are not discovered or yet patched. Moving on to another example of risks examples is the cyber and physical attacks. For example, cyber attacks could include DDoS attack, buffer overflow, any type of cyber attack, and physical attacks could include being there in the same building that the data is stored, and then, for example, stealing the hard drives or damaging the hard drives. Another example is accidents and disasters. Accidents and disasters can be considered as risks. For example, disasters could be similar to earthquakes. For example, locating the building or the data center near to an earthquake-prone area. And accidental, meaning that, for example, misconfiguring the server or the DNS servers, similar to what happened with Facebook, and disabling all of the services by mistake or by an accident of misconfiguration. Moving on to our second topic, which is risk assessment, its definition and value. Risk assessment is concerned with identifying and estimating three main things. The first thing is the internal and external threats. The second thing is the impact on the CIA triad, which is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data. The last thing is the possibility of getting harmed or losing any assets from these threats. Risk assessment is considered the first step of a much holistic approach, which is the risk management. It's just the first step to identify the risks, then the risk management can disable these attacks or even prevent them. So the main question right now is how to perform an assessment for risk within your organization. Actually, risk assessment has a lot of methodologies and a lot of taxonomies and architectures. In this presentation, we're going to talk about an architecture which deals into three categories. The first category is risk models, assessment approaches, and analysis approaches. So what are risk models? It's basically 7 factors of risk. Identifying these 7 factors would result in you identifying your risk model. These factors include the threat source, which is identifying, for example, what is attacking you? Where is the threat originating from? The second factor is the likelihood of that threat attacking you specially. So, for example, would a large DDoS attack your personal image server, for example, in your house? This is highly unlikely. The threat event itself, for example, the scenario where the threat occurs or how do the threat occurs. For example, in DDoS, you have to make a botnet, to gather a botnet, mask your IP address, etc., etc. The fourth risk factor is the likelihood of that scenario succeeding. For example, will the botnet, for example, cooperate and be on one holistic army and attack, or is it a very low opportunity to attack, or do you have countermeasures for that scenario? Vulnerabilities within your system is considered the fifth risk factor. Vulnerabilities could include, for example, an unpatched bug. For example, the Windows spooler bug that was available in Windows for like 15 or 20 years before it was patched. Or, for example, not using a proxy server to protect your own main web server before exposing it to the internet. After that, we have the impact of that attack. For example, the exposure of secure information. For example, if you overflow the buffer or the buffer is overflowed due to an attack, the attacker will have privileged information, otherwise not accessible to normal users. Finally, the organizational risk, which is, for example, losing the revenue due to not accessing your website, for example, because of a DDoS. For example, if Amazon got hit for like few seconds, they would lose millions of revenue due to this unavailability of the website. Back again to our taxonomy here, we finished the risk models. The second step we're going to talk about is the assessment approaches. Okay, so we have 2 types of approaches. We can, let's say, approach the risk assessment in a quantitative way or approach it in a qualitative way. Let's first talk about the quantitative way, because the quantitative way is actually the most scientific, the most common, and actually what matters most to the CEOs and the business holders. This quantitative approach actually has a lot of formulas, a lot of factors that can be measured physically and quantitatively. So for example, one of the main factors is the AV, the asset value. It's measured in money. For example, this can be the cost to replace the web server. For example, the web server here we have at KU for Otis. This can be the cost of the web server itself, 400,000. Then we can talk about the exposure factor. The exposure factor is the possibility that your server would be attacked. For example, we have a high possibility here because this is a public server that is accessed by thousands of users, students and non-students. After that, we have the SLE, the single loss expectancy, which is also measured in the money unit. This is basically the multiplication of the AV and EF. So you multiply the asset value by the exposure factor and you get the SLE. After that, you have the ARO, the annualized rate of occurrence. Like how many times would your server be attacked per year, or would your server face a risk, not just an attack? For example, a risk could include an overload from legitimate traffic of the students, for example. This can happen 4 times a year because of the students overloading the server at the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester. After that, we have the ALE, which is annualized loss expectancy, which is basically the SLE multiplied by the ARO. So you multiply these two values together to get the ALE. So basically, this amount is the amount required from KAU to maintain the Otis server for 1 year. However, in the same time, if we add the ACS, the annualized cost of safeguards, for example, implementing a backup server, like located in a remote country even, not in Saudi Arabia. This backup server that can handle the overload is considered, for example, a very small investment, 80,000, for example. The result of adding this safeguard is a reduction in ARO. For example, instead of failing 4 times a year or experiencing risk 4 times a year, it's now reduced to 2 times a year. And then the LA cost proportionally is also reduced to the half. So basically, KAU has to pay now this amount only instead of the 1 million, which results in a cost-benefit analysis in saving this amount. So basically, KAU don't have to pay this amount. Another approach is the qualitative approach. This approach basically categorizes risks into categories rather than giving them a numerical value. So for example, you would assess the asset, which is in our case the Otis server, web server, as a high value asset, and the threat, for example, overloading of legitimate student traffic, as a moderate asset, because there's no exposure of information. It's just like a delay in the response or denial of servers for like 1 hour or 2 hours at max. Finally, the vulnerability, for example, in this case, or why did the overload even happen? Because let's say, for example, KU has a lot of data centers or has a lot of servers that are capable of receiving this traffic. So, for example, because of the Otis is a legacy program, maybe it uses an HTTP protocol that is very old, that it cannot handle a lot of open connections at the same time. So this is, let's say, for example, a very high vulnerability that can be actually exploited from another threat, not just this threat. Another approach is the hybrid approach. It's actually called semi-quantitative approach. It's actually a mix. So you use your numerical values and you also use different categories. It's basically similar to the grading system. So if someone got an A, he actually got from 90 to 95. This is like his grade. So for example, here actually we can say the same thing. The first category is a high risk. It ranges from 90 to 100, for example, and we can give it even a symbol, a grade. The difference between the qualitative approach and the hybrid approach is that the risk can be assigned, for example, values 92, 93, and this 93 will be different from 92, and 93, of course, will be different from 90. So these small steps matter, but not like the different big steps from this high to low. Okay, back again to our taxonomy here. We finished the risk models, the risk assessment approaches, finally the analysis approaches. So you can analyze the threat assessment after you collected all of the data after you made all of the risk models. You can analyze the data in 3 different methodologies. The first methodology is threat oriented. So basically you care about the threat source, how does it formulate, and how to mitigate it. Like, you only care about the threat, you don't care about the asset, you don't care also about the vulnerabilities you have in your system. This can lead you to skipping a lot of information because you are focusing only on one aspect. The second approach is the asset impact oriented approach. For example, you assess the consequence of losing such asset. For example, the consequence of losing the KEU server only, but you don't look at the threats, you don't look at the vulnerabilities. So also it's not a holistic approach. Finally, the vulnerability oriented approach also looks at the weak parts of the system. For example, looks at the fact that the KEU server is a legacy system, the fact that there might be a lot of bugs that was programmed and could not be patched, for example, because the original programmers are not there anymore. But you also forget about the threat, or also you forget about the value of the asset. So actually none of these are used in a standalone scenario in real life. Most of them are used either together or the combination of the 3. Hence, the graph analysis. Graph analysis actually takes care of that and uses relationship between, for example, vulnerabilities and threats, many threats to one vulnerability, and simplifying it using a diagram with these relationships can also result in a clearer risk assessment approach. Finally, after gathering all of the information and analyzing the risk, you have to convey all of these informations through briefings, like small meetings and daily meetings, and reports to the stakeholders in the organization. For example, the owner of the security, for example, a department, the head of department, the CEO, the managers, all of those are considered stakeholders in the organization that need to know about such risks. Also, risks are continuously evolving. So thinking that you only perform the risk assessment one time and that's it is actually an incorrect concept. And finally, small organizations. Some of us, when they hear of risk assessment, they think of, for example, the big companies like Facebook, like Cisco, whatever. But actually, small organizations need risk assessment more than larger scale companies do, because in larger scale companies, their capital is so high, they could afford losing a lot of assets without getting out of business. On the contrary, with the small organizations, a single loss of asset could take them also out of business. So smaller organizations do actually need risk assessment more than larger scale organizations. Finally, thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed the video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.